So we have an awesome group today for our discussion on family dynamics in writing. So let me give a moment here to introduce our wonderful panelists. As a graduate of Florida State University, Robert Gwaltney presently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. By day, he serves as Vice President of Easter Seals North Georgia Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that strengthens children and their families during the most critical times in their development. Through his nonprofit work, he's a champion of early childhood literacy. Robert also serves as a contributing editor for the Blue Mountain Review. And in all those hours in between, because he's Superman, he writes. And The Cicada Tree is his fantastic Southern Gothic debut novel. Robert, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Gilly Segal grew up in Florida and spent her college years in Israel. Now she calls Atlanta, Georgia her home. By day, she is the chief legal officer for an advertising agency. And in her other life, Gilly is a co-author of the New York Times bestseller, I'm Not Dying Without You Tonight. When not writing, Gilly enjoys cheering on the Tampa Bay Lightning, exploring Decatur with her 3 kids, and sampling flavors of French macarons. Oh my gosh, that sounds like fun. Shaun Hamill. He received his VA in English from the University of Texas at Arlington, his MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. His debut novel is The Cosmology of Monsters. It was published by Pantheon Books in September of 2019. His fictions has appeared in Carve and Toward Night Fires, Come Join Us by the Fire. His nonfiction has appeared in Crime Reads and Toward Night Fire, and he lives in Arlington, Texas, and he is in edit on his second novel that we can't wait to read. So welcome.
Thank you.
Finally, last but certainly not least, we have with us Ann Hite. Ann Hite, Ghost on Black Mountain, won the Georgia Author of the Year and was shortlisted for the Townsend Prize in 2012. Her novel, Sleeping Above Chaos, was Georgia Author of the Year 2017 finalist. Roll the Stone Away became Georgia Author of the Year 2021 honorable mention in the memoir category. So, wow, we have got such a great group this morning. So, in preparing for this panel, I think we have mostly Southerners or Southern transplants, so there's something about family in the South for sure. But I know that family's been so influential in my life and my writing as well, for the good and the bad, but that bad is that material that we draw upon. I have a couple of questions just to kind of get us started, but please feel free to make this kind of loose. Follow-up questions, talk to each other as well as to me. Let's just start off kind of broad. If we could, let's talk about how has family or other cultures and groups that are important to you influenced the work or the genre that you're writing in. And I want to throw this to Gilly, because what an interesting childhood you had. So we'll start with you about family and other cultures that have influenced your writing.
Yeah. I think family shapes who we are and how we think about things. And I write, 2 of my novels are young adult novels, and I find it really interesting to think about the way that the environment that we grow up in shapes who we are, because young adulthood is the time when you are first beginning to break away from that, right? So in, sort of the middle grade years, your immediate milieu is really your family environment. And then YA, you're beginning to interact with the greater world around you. And hopefully that also means pushing back against the greater world around you. And I think that's why you see a lot of young adult stories in which the parents are non-existent or absentee. It's because kids are supposed to rebel and push back and figure out who they are in their greater context, which is certainly something I did, obviously moving halfway across the world and announcing to my parents one day I was dropping out of college after freshman year. So, so that was an interesting family dynamic in my home for a little while.
Was that really influential in you choosing to work in YA, those experiences?
Sure. The experiences that we have as young adults often are so powerful and so emotional. And I love YA in part because it is really unabashedly emotional, and really plot driven and exciting. And you're the center of your own universe when you're a teenager. I'm also raising a teenager these days, and I see that a lot. So, yeah, I think I like writing about that time in life when everything is so close to the surface. And often it's the first time you're experiencing these things that makes for really fun drama.
Well, speaking of fun drama, Shaun, I want to throw this over to you because Cosmology of Monsters is all about a family at the heart of that novel. And how was it that your family influenced either the writing of that book or some of your other work?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I guess that book is sort of, I mean, not in terms of the literal events that happen or even the members of the fictional family versus the real family, but in terms of emotion, it is very autobiographical in terms of what it felt like to grow up in the home where I grew up. So it's sort of, without taking specific events from my family history, I was able to sort of take the way those events felt and sort of graft them onto other events that, induce sort of similar emotional reactions, hopefully in the reader and in the characters. So yeah, it was definitely, I'm, trying to specifically what it's like to live with mentally ill people. Just what it's like to love someone, especially when you're little and you don't really understand it, or when you're a young adult and you understand it maybe, objectively, but subjectively, it still just doesn't make sense on a day-to-day level to you, why somebody just can't get out of bed or why they can't just cheer up or whatever, especially if you don't necessarily or haven't had your own first, major depressive episode or whatever. If it just hasn't hit you as hard as it hit the rest of your family. I thought that was something that I could really bring to my fiction was I am touched by it, but maybe not as heavily as the other members of the people of my family of origin. So being a little bit of an outsider, even in that regard, within my own home, I thought was a really interesting perspective I could bring to it.
That's interesting about being an outsider in your own home. I like the way you put that. That's pretty powerful.
Oh, thank you.
And in your bio, it says that you said that you wrote a memoir. It was very, very well recognized. That's a little bit different from what we've been talking about so far. How did your family background sort of influence you or motivate you to write in that particular genre of memoir? And it's pretty dicey sometimes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And not fortunately, but all of my family except my brother are now dead, so I don't have to worry about offending anyone or, but my fiction writing is all set in Appalachia, which I was raised, just to give you a background, I was raised by an Appalachian grandmother, which if anybody knows anything about Appalachia knows that that's definitely unique, different from just being in the South. But my book, Roll the Stone Away, which is the book that you're talking about, the memoir, I decided maybe if I wrote about my family and the things that happened, which is the racism that was in there, the secrets I found after, when I started researching and everybody was dead. And so I started finding these huge secrets that I thought my grandmother had told me everything because we were very close and she really hadn't told me anything. And, which is most of the time is the case of most families, especially in the South, especially Appalachia. But yeah, so for me, it was, I thought I would write it and then I wouldn't write about it again because my fiction is full of, I don't do it on purpose, but when I'm through with a novel, I'll go back to do the edits with the publisher and I'll say, oh my God, I've put it in there again. I've got it in here, it just doesn't go away. And I thought if I wrote the memoir and my publisher asked me to write it, that maybe, but it didn't work. So I still put it in the fiction. So I guess who we are as a family, it's what you grow up with, and there was a lot of mental illness in my family. And so that bleeds over into my fiction, especially in the fiction, but then I did address that in the memoir too.
That is fascinating that Roll the Stone Away was like the initial purpose was a sort of catharsis or bloodletting of that. And then you say, but it just still didn't go away. Is anything changed with your fiction after that? You say it hasn't gone away, but have you noticed a shift after doing the memoir and then going back to fiction?
I noticed that I'm even more honest in my fiction now. And I think fiction is probably the most honest genre, because we don't always know that we're being as honest as we are in fiction until later. But yeah, I noticed that I don't have the, embarrassment of, oh, I don't want people to know that, which is also what you're raised with in my family in the South. We don't air our dirty laundry. And I aired it all and Rolled the Stone Away. I don't think I left anything. and it was really hard. It was a book that just gutted me. And I promised myself I will never have to do that again. I will not write another memoir, which probably means I will. But, because when you say you don't, right? But
right.
Yeah,
right.
When I wrote this book that just came out, my short story collection, it was for fun because I needed something fun after writing that book. I needed something. It's not light because I don't write light, but it's fun. It was fun to write. Lots of ghosts. So.
Well, thank you. Wow. Robert, you have just released your debut novel, The Gorgeous is a Cicada Tree, and it is family is at the heart of that novel as well. Could you talk a little bit about how your experiences with family or people that you knew influenced or did not influence that book?
Well, I think in an episode of Designing Women, Julia Sugarbaker said, we don't keep our eccentrics or crazy people in the attic. We bring them down to the porch for everybody to take a look at. So I follow that as guidance when I was writing the book. I'm a lifelong Southerner, a resident of the South, and my mom and dad are still in the community that I grew up in. So, it was just natural that I would choose Southern fiction as the genre. And of course, coming from family of eccentrics and misfits, moving into the realm of the Southern Gothic was also a natural thing for me to do as well. I think from a cultural perspective, of the South, being me, being a gay person growing up in Cairo, Georgia, it's certainly in the Cicada Tree that there are these themes sort of being an outsider and being isolated and living on the fringe. And I think that when I wrote 11-year-old Annalise Newell, I certainly was mindful of those experiences as a young person growing up in Southwest Georgia.
That's fascinating. That kind of not necessarily autobiographical, but definitely informing that character.
Yes, I have a theory that there's no such thing as fiction, really. There are threads of ourselves through our work, and I really can relate to all of the characters in the Cicada Tree.
Okay.
I do believe, I have a certain respect and understanding of all of them, and I think that they are composites of myself and people I've known through the years.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's amazing. I find that fascinating how authors' lives and the people they know influence their work. And it seems like that's true for everybody here. Going back to Gilly, we've talked about influence, but how do you think that in your fiction, you're able to create realistic dynamics? Like, what are some of your influences or tools in creating those dynamics or relationships within the work that you do? And it doesn't necessarily have to be blood relatives. I mean, family can be, those are the family that you choose also. So
yeah, I really agree with Robert's point, right? Is we're inspired by, or you look to yourself and the people you know, right? And often a starting point when you're working on a scene or a character is, what would I do in this situation? How would that affect me? Or how would it affect somebody I know, right? Or you're looking around and you're a constant observer. I hope we're constant observers as writers. So, sometimes it's as simple as watching an interaction that other people are having in a public place and going, that's an interesting reaction that person had. Or, that turn of phrase is really interesting. So there's I don't think even fiction is not realistic, right? It's plausible because these are stories, we're inventing them. So what you're looking for is, what's a plausible response or reaction for this character given this character's background that I have created for them, this person's lived experiences. And all of that comes from what you know of yourself and what you know of the people around you.
So, Gilly, just a little follow-up here with based on what you were talking about being an observer. Are you someone who writes like snatches of things out of order? Are you, I hate the terms plotter and pantser, but I'm just going to go there. Do you plan a work like in a large scope, or do you just let it take you where you find things and write things out of order? I'm throwing a craft question at you real quick. I'm sorry, but that just stuck in my head when you were talking about listening into other people.
So when I first started out, back when I was the queen of the 30-page novel that I could never finish, I was a pantser. I would have described myself as like, I'm a pantser. I don't write outlines. Well, come to find out that when I write an outline, I finish the book. So I'm a pretty hardcore plotter. Mostly for that reason, right? And there's no right or wrong answer to this. I used to feel really discouraged when someone would give writing advice and be like, you have to write the outline and beat sheets and all those things. The answer is like, you figure out what works for you, and that's totally okay. What I encourage is, if one technique that you've been trying is not working for you, experiment with another for a little while, because I didn't realize I was a plotter until I started plotting, and it became successful for me.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I will come back to plotter or pantser for the rest of y'all later in the panel, because I love to hear that answer. But I want to kind of keep us with this idea of, how do you actually go about creating these believable dynamics? So I'm going to impose on what Gilly just said with her follow-up, that one way you do that is actually structure. You're imposing structure on your story. And how do you create these believable dynamics? What are some of your tools when you approach a story, fiction? Let's still stick with the fiction for a moment.
Yep, especially with the fiction, yes. For me, I just get the character. I'm very character driven. So I get the character is just in me, and I find out as much as I possibly can about the character. How would they react to this, and how would they react to that? And other characters kind of feed in once I know who this character is. I start knowing more about her mother, if that's good. There's always a mother, and I'm always dealing with a mother in my fiction, so I find a little bit more about who the mother is through the character and how the character views her. I may come from the mother's point of view at some point, but I learn about the different characters and the dynamics between them through that main protagonist of the book. So it's exploring her. It's not, it's not a perfect thing. A perfect way. I wouldn't suggest it to anybody, but it seems to work for me, is to just know my character inside and out. And so I may spend, so somebody is trying to write really fast wouldn't want to do it my way, but I may spend, a couple of months, 3 or 4 months or longer, just with the character writing things from her point of view, thinking about allowing myself to do that, which, and that's how I come to, and having lived, I mean, growing up in a family with all kinds of dynamics helps you find, you know, the right way to react and the wrong way to react. It'll feel natural to you. If you're a mom, you know how you would react to something. If you were a daughter, you know how you would react to something from your mom. So it's kind of just a natural thing too that I find. But I might go over something several times to get it right. If it doesn't feel, I go a lot with the gut. If it doesn't feel right, then I just keep writing and tinkering with it until it does.
So it's very character driven. A lot of pre-planning and exploring the character. Sounds like a lot of recursive writing, like going back and digging further before you actually get into story. So once you've done that, is that a jumping off point and you just keep going, following the character? So are you more of a, I guess, pantser, or do once you've done that stage, do you plot out where you're going in detail or just broadly?
I never thought of myself as a plotter, but I realized as I did more than one book that my first draft is really an outline. You know, it's
okay.
You wouldn't, I mean, I wouldn't show it to anybody, and I always worry I'll die and somebody will find it and say, God, she lost her talent. That's why she died. But you know, it's just so true. But I realized what it is I'm getting the story down, I'm outlining it. And then the second draft is that's the fun. That's where I go in and actually write the book. But if I don't like calling it outline or, you know, plotter or pantser, because it's just what works. I go straight through and I don't edit. I go all the way to the end with whatever. And that's the plot. I see the plot. It emerges within, I have to see it the way the reader will read it. So it's hard for me to do the bullet points and that kind of thing, because I think then I wouldn't allow myself to change anything as I went along. I would say, oh no, it's in there. It's in the outline. See, I got to stick with that. That's the kind of person I can be.
Right.
So yeah, it's not perfect. I wouldn't suggest it to anybody, believe me, but it works for me.
It sounds like, Anne, you and Gilly, you guys have really customized your approach. Shaun, what tools do you use in your writing to develop these dynamics? Family dynamics, friend dynamics?
Well, I mean, my process, I don't think it's quite as involved as what Anne's describing, but there is definitely that sense of exploration and play. Dialogue actually ends up being a huge tool for me, at least in a first draft. I have my characters just talk to each other a lot. And there's a lot of negotiation that happens there, a lot of figuring out, you know, what they want, where they're coming from, what they're thinking about, and sort of almost like eavesdropping on them. You know, I think it's because I started out, whenever I started writing, I wanted to be a screenwriter. So I tend to think in terms of story externally rather than, and I'm still learning how to work from the inside out when it comes to character. So that's still a tool that, and the thing I'm working on now, like there's just tons and tons of dialogue that I'm sure won't be in the second draft. That's really helping me figure out like who these people are, and how they're going to relate to each other. And usually there's, you know, something interesting or fun will come out of that. And, you know, there will be something I can use later down the line, or, you know, if it's all terrible, I can just scrap it, you know, as well. You know, my favorite teacher at Iowa, Paul Harding, said it's always easier to take stuff out than it is to put stuff in. So, you know, I just try to, you know, just follow every possible lead, every blind alley when I'm working on a first draft, just grow this big, you know, messy garden of pages, and then sort of trim it into something pretty.
Well, and I want a quick follow-up with you, Shaun. Your first book, you said, was very autobiographical. you're currently drafting in your second book, second novel. Has your approach changed in any way? Are you as dependent on maybe the influence of your life as you were with the first one?
Yeah. I'd say so. I'm in edits on the second book, and I'm writing the third book now as a first draft. So that's with the second, yeah. Well, the edits are taking a little longer than I'd like. So to preserve my sanity, I'm working on another book while I wait. It's unfortunately with every book for me, it seems like I have to reinvent the wheel. I'm always looking for a better way to do it. I read so many craft books. I'm that person who's looking for the shortcut, the way forward that's going to let me write a book every 18 months or something like that. And I just don't think that I'm that person. I think I am somebody who needs to spend that time exploring. With the second book, I took a much more structured approach, and it worked. But for the third book, I've sort of doubled back to more exploration, more fun, more wandering, I guess, to sort of let the book tell me what it wants to be. And who knows, maybe for book 4, I'll go back to something more structured. It's like each book I have to figure out how to write each one. There is no one technique so far that's been like, I'll just do this forever and I've got a book. I wish I were that person.
I really like that point, actually. I don't know that any of us are. I know tons of authors who are like, this thing that worked for this book didn't work for this book at all. I really liked what Anne said before about writing from the perspective of one of your characters. It's not a technique I tried. And I was like, let me take a little note. I'm struggling with a character on my current work in progress. I'm going to try that. So I think there's more flexibility to this than we often presume.
Thank you.
Hey, Gilly, what you just said there, I hope all of our panelists, not our panelists, excuse me, all of our attendees who are aspiring writers hear that here is an established, successful writer who hears what another writer does and says, hey, I want to try that. Because I think I remember thinking before I met writers, oh, you guys are just, you have it down, you don't change, you got, and it's been so wonderful and enlightening to meet writers actually and talk with them about that. So that's fantastic that you're going to steal Anne's approach there.
Yeah, if it works, you get all the credit. If it doesn't, I'll be able to, nobody will ever know.
Oh.
Well, Robert, this is so great that you're going to be coming at the end of this like wave of questions here, because we have all these different approaches, all these different tools people are using to approach their novel or their work. With your first novel and maybe any other work that you're working on now, what techniques did you use to actually get words on the page and get those family dynamics as really vivid? Because that's really key to your book. You got to really have that work. So what were some of the tools that you used?
Well, so the story is told in first person from the point of view of an 11-year-old girl. So it's, I think, like Anne was sharing, it's really understanding the protagonist, who they are, their perceptions of their position in the family, and the reality of their position in the family, I think is critical. But I think that for all of the family members, you really have to have distinctive voices, which would be, how they approach dialogue, their mannerisms. For me, I think for family dynamic, what's most interesting is what's not said, as to what is. So an individual's physicality, how they enter the room, where they sit at the table, how they regard one another, I think is very telling. And I spent a lot of time trying to show, not tell, in regards to the family dynamic. I know that's a bit of a platitude, right? We always say, oh, show, don't tell. But it was really important, I think, the way that a conversation might occur between two family members that might pique the young protagonist's curiosity, so for me, there was always this sense of electricity passing between characters, that unsaid dynamic. And of course, you're going to want conflict. Of course, all novels need conflict. And then just ensuring, but once you understand that family dynamic and the relationships between characters, how you can manipulate the scene to be able to heighten emotion.
That is fascinating. So you have your characters, you know what each person is like and what they want. When you were talking, I was thinking about what you said earlier about, like, in the South, we put the sugar baker quote, we put our eccentrics on the front porch. But I was also thinking the South is very much a, quote, polite society. There's so much we don't say. I know Anne was talking about all the secrets in her family, for example. What you don't show, how does that relate to conflict maybe in a scene?
Sure. Well, for Annalise, I mean, first of all, in Southern Gothic, and I say that it's Southern Gothic, it really has Gothic tendencies. I don't think that from an academic perspective, it's purely Southern Gothic. I think I cross genre a bit, but I think that it's I think what's not being said piques Annalise's curiosity, and it really sort of incites obsession, which within her, not only the curiosity and secrets within her own family, but the curiosity that she has for this wealthy local family, the Mayfields. So it's what's not said, and it's the whispers, and it's the caught conversations that she's able to happen into that really helps drive conflict and her motivation.
Well, and that idea of that character being curious and it drives the conflict. Is there anything about her age that kind of contributes to that? You said she's 11, so is there anything that you felt was very important about the character's age with her conflict in the story?
So the novel is really told from an older Annalise, Annalise Newell, who is the protagonist. So really, she's a young adult looking back on the summer of 1956 when she was 11. So, and I did that intentionally because I wanted to be able to use the language that I love, and of course, I was able, of course, had to capture what a young 11-year-old girl would sound like in dialogue. And of course, within internal dialogue as well. No, but for 11, I think that for me, I mean, that was it's sort of this in-between age where, you're smart enough to understand and to be able to puzzle out the subtext that's occurring in a room or between individuals. And I just love the idea of obsession and lost innocence and coming of age, really. Those are some of the things that I covered in the book. But I do want to say, when we were talking about craft, you think that if you write one book, you'll be able to easily write another. and what I've learned is that you learn a little, but really you have, and I think that Shaun tapped into this, is that each book that you write, you have to learn how to write that book. So there's I'm at the beginning of a new project and I'm thinking, oh my God, how do I do this? It's like learning how to tell the story all over again.
Amen.
Anybody wants to add, Shaun, please, if you've got a craft question to throw in there, because I know that's what our panelists are very curious about.
Oh, I just wanted to chime in and say I agree.
Yes. I think that's the message here, that it's a new process every time almost. And as you progress, you learn the tools that work for you and those that don't. But sometimes one tool that works in a past project might not work for the current one. That's interesting. Well, before we get into our question and answer, I got two questions that I kind of want to combine. Place, particularly for Southern fiction, but I think place wherever it takes place, is very important when it comes to family dynamics. Family is often very tied to the place of their family, of their culture. Could y'all talk a little bit about the importance of place and maybe dialect and dialogue, if that relates? I want to start with Anne because of the Appalachian. How does place do you consciously think fuel particular work?
For me, place is just another character. It's
right. Okay.
the most important character, because it's the home, it's the place that holds these people. And if you've ever been around a true Appalachian family, you'd understand that completely. Just sitting with them a few minutes. When I first met that part of my family, I was probably between 9 and 10 years old, and I had lived in Germany and had a whole nother life and went through culture shock just coming to Marietta. And then I went to Appalachia to visit my great aunts and thought, what is this place? It's a different planet. And the way they talked, I didn't my aunt said, go in the kitchen and get that poke off the table. And I looked at my grandmother like, what's a poke? Because I don't know. And she said, the bag that's on the table. And so that was kind of my baptism into a different language. And so to me, it's really important to preserve that language. It's like music. It's part of who I am. It's part of who these people are. And it's slowly going away because, so many young people are told not to do it, get rid of it, and I think that's really sad. So for me, place is just, it's a character. It's so important because it grounds that reader in, what the story's going to be about, because it is about place. Robert's book is definitely about place. I'm not answering for you, Robert, but it is. I mean, I go back and I think, oh, he really got place, when I read his book. I mean, it's just a character, and it's there all the time. It's there all the time, letting you know, okay, now you're going to go over here and this is going to happen. And this is, it's, to me, it's the best, it's the most fun to write place.
Well, and I want to do the follow-up then with Robert. Robert, as Ann said, place is so important to your work. How much of that place do you feel like you're reproducing? It's really like this, or was really like this? And how much do you let yourself maybe fictionalize place in the service of that connection with family and your themes?
Well, first I have to say it is an honor and terrifying to follow up Ann Hite in conversation. And just the fact that she read my book is astonishing to me. So I'm very grateful for that. So you're right. I mean, place is so important, and in place really build conflict. And there's sort of, I did not utilize a real place. I sort of world built within the novel. And so the town that the story takes place is called Providence, Georgia. But I placed it on or around where I grew up in Southwest Georgia in Cairo. So I cherry picked things. And of course, with place, I do believe, like Anne does, that place is a character, especially in Southern fiction. It's such an important backdrop because, the summers can be oppressive. That's going to impact the countenance of the characters within, and it's just going to help ramp up conflict and build emotion. And then just, the social mores of the culture. The story takes place in 1956, mid-century Georgia, pre-civil rights. So, what I liked about the 1950s and contemplating the South is that it seems on the surface that the 1950s really is that last time in America where the culture was innocent. But really, if you scratch beneath the veneer, there's societal and sexual and social repression. So storms are so all of that works together, the place, the setting, and the time that you choose. And I was very mindful of those things when I was writing the story.
And you're bringing up a fantastic point that I want to remind our attendees about, that place is not just a physical location. it is the culture, but it's also the time period that's really important, which I want to throw over to Shaun, because Shaun, I know that yours moves amongst different time periods, and your book, I think I'll argue, is a Southern book, but it's kind of suburban. So it doesn't kind of fit the same niche exactly. So talk a little bit about why place was really important for the characters in your book, the city or maybe physical buildings in the story. hint.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because the book takes place mostly in a suburb of Fort Worth that's based on my hometown of Arlington, Texas. But there is this other presence. There's a city in the book, an unnamed city that's sort of this looming presence that's sort of this bigger, cosmic threat that looms, that is home to the monsters in the book. And it's not something I really thought about much whenever I was writing the book, but it is sort of this interesting dynamic between the suburbs, which are supposedly an innocent place, right? And the city, which is a much more adult playground kind of, where, it's a little easier in most cities, I would say, versus the suburbs for people who are a little outside the mainstream to live their truths and to, not have to hide as much about who they are. So that was definitely something that I think was brewing under the surface that I wasn't really entirely aware of, even though it is a book about secrets and the things we don't talk about. And of course, the son who, the child in the family, my narrator, Noah, who knows the least of anyone about anything that's happened to this family, being the one who's going into the city and who has all these questions that are sort of unanswered. And then, ultimately brings everything to a head for the family where they have to sort of confront, their past and their grief and all of that. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. And I will say that I did, it's less, showy, I think. Not showy is the wrong word. It's less physically present than a lot of my favorite Southern literature, but I did work hard to sort of get the feel of a North Texas suburb right in the book. And that is something a lot of people from my hometown are like, yeah, you got Arlington dead to rights, especially in the 90s. So so that is something that I did take pride in, even though it's maybe not as grand as some of the descriptions in my favorite Southern Gothic stuff, but it is something that I did take seriously.
With the idea, again, to restate what Robert said, it's not just place, it's time. So when they said, and it can be something that on the surface we think, oh, that was just yesterday, but really the 90s were not yesterday, y'all, even though it feels that way. That the 90s in Arlington had a special flavor that is not there anymore. And so that you were able to capture that. That's how hard was that to go back into time and do that?
It was actually sort of I don't want to say a crutch, but it was kind of a crutch because it was the time period when I was growing up. So it was really easy for me to reach back into my own memories and use that, because there was so much else about writing that book that was so difficult. It was like, well, here are the tools I can use to help me get from one end of this book to the other. And one of those is, I grew up in a place like this. I know how to write about this. So I'm, instead of setting it, in a big city where I've never lived, I'm going to set it here in this little town, in the shadow of a big city.
So you write young adult, and it's not just your characters are young. It's that you're trying to target a young readership. So is there any way that you feel that setting and those relationships that are so important to young adults, that you approach it in your work?
Yeah, I think it's interesting for young adults to think of setting not just as as large as the South, but as local as your high school, right? So place, actually, the original title of our first book was actually The Neighborhood, because we like to say the neighborhood itself is the third main character of the novel. because the entirety of the action takes place in this one location. The way that our characters speak and interact with one another is dependent upon that location. For one of the characters, this is home. This is her hometown. And she speaks the way she speaks in that location because that's where she's comfortable. She's a Black character. She doesn't code switch because she wouldn't. This is her. Why would she do that? This is her neighborhood. So I think it's interesting to think about it, not just kind of on a global scale, but also in a hyper local setting. How do you talk when you're in your high school? How do you speak when you're home? Maybe those two things are different, right? For teenagers, a thing that adults, writers sometimes struggle with is the amount of teen speak, slang that we put into, right? Vernacular. And I think as an adult, it's a little easy to overdo it, right? That was actually some of the feedback we got back on our early drafts of that first book from teenagers was like, dial back that slang, 40-year-olds. We don't say it quite that much. Right? My ears, it sounds like every other word, you know, is teen talk, but it's really not for them. So the way that, and where they are affects that, you know, my teenager at home doesn't speak to me the way that she speaks when she's in her high school. So setting is not just where you live, it's also where you are in the moment and how you're interacting with people in that particular location.
And I want to bring that together with what Gilly just said. That's a great way to just kind of bring together all the threads in our panel, is the idea that setting and dialogue can shift so subtly in narrow, like at a hyperly narrow locations, and those dynamics can affect, like there's the family at home dynamic that's at place, and then there's your high school peers, there's that place, and how those dynamics can inform all these other elements in your story. That's fascinating. And I like the idea too that you got feedback from your target audience. So that's a very valuable tip for our attendees. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. We've got tons of questions. Y'all are so popular. So I'm just going to go to the Q&A, and I'm going to see if I can pick a couple of, let's see, we've got, so Jan Odom, she was one of our early questions. She said, I'm writing a novel about ex-Vietnam veteran whose family is broken. And post-war, he collects others around him who become his new family. What should I be thinking about as I try to craft this plot line? That's a great premise. I'm just gonna throw that. Does anybody have some ideas they'd like to take from that for Jan?
I mean, one thing I might suggest, and it doesn't have to be something that you use for the long haul, but at least to help get you going, is thinking about what is each person fulfilling in this family, for what need for this character is this person, you know, what are they getting from this that that draws them into the story. And, you know, it may end up not being something you need, but whenever I'm pulling characters together, that's one of the tricks that I use, is just what do they need from each other, or what are they giving each other that the other person needs or wants.
I think also, this is a found family story, and I love those, by the way, right? I think especially as adults, and as we all sort of separate, a lot of us have found families that are as important to us as our biological family. But with a found family story, I think it's really important to think about what binds them and what keeps them together, right? There isn't that sort of ostensible DNA level binding that you have in a biological family, but there are other really important ties. And even if they don't, as Shaun is saying, make it onto the page, for you as an author to understand why does this found family stay together, can really sort of help enrich the dynamics.
Okay, we have another question. This is Zach has got a really interesting question here. It says, Robert discussed the importance of what an individual does not say in terms of characterization. When you're building tension in the narrative, how do you balance creating tension and suspense in the scene and avoid melodrama? And that can be forever, anybody, because that's a great question.
Yeah, it's extremely hard, you know, and I actually am a fan of melodrama. You know, I love a good soap opera. But yeah, it's interesting. I think for building tension, well, first of all, anytime you have more than one person in a room, you're juggling. because you have to keep a sense of, the folks that are in the room, what are they doing? It's the more individuals in the room, the more challenging. But for me, and with this particular novel, sound, and music and taste of the senses were really important. So, there might be something auditory that's going on in the room that's helping perhaps ramp up tension. It really is just going to depend upon your novel and the characters and the unique structure. But it is hard. I find myself overriding and then coming back and pulling my toes back over the line, to be able to avoid melodrama.
It's kind of what Shaun had said earlier about it's easier to take out from his writing teacher than put in.
Right.
But we
It's
have
like
a
that
question.
Chanel, it's like that Chanel rule of thumb. You look in the mirror and you take
Yes.
you take one thing off. Yeah.
Absolutely, I do that. Good rule. Well, Carrie, she has a question that I think would be a great follow-up with the previous question. In my senior English class, we're using writing language like, quote, look at the author's craft moves, rather than literary devices or figurative language, because it feels less restrictive. We are trying to teach them to read like writers. Can you share your favorite craft move, especially when creating a mood that the reader will feel in family interaction? That's a great question. Great English teacher. So got a favorite craft move that helps maybe create a mood, maybe with the family interactions, or just anything in your writing that's a favorite craft move?
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Well, for me, I think I stated this earlier in regards to family dynamic. Again, for me, it was not what was being said, but sort of those mannerisms and the physical interaction. There are two adults in the family. There's Annalise's mother, and then there is an older Black woman who comes into the home with her granddaughter, and they become this united family union. But Annalise is often, of course, there are secrets, and there are these moments, these conversations that occur between the mother and Miss Wessey, and there's this sense that there's this current of electricity flowing between the two of them, and the glances that they give one another. So it's palpable in the room.
So Robert, you're talking about like maybe describing an action or a look that's kind of like just trying to underscore some subtext that's happening in your scene,
Right.
for that electricity. Okay,
So,
that's a great craft move. What we don't put in.
And also what I find interesting is when what someone is saying is completely opposite of their internal dialogue.
Yes, that's great. And so Southern. Gilly, you were going to add something to that about craft moves.
Yeah, I was just saying, sometimes it's helpful for me to think about this in terms of pace, right? So if I want to slow down and force the reader to really focus on and grapple with what I'm talking about, I'm gonna slow the pace down with interiority, and I'm gonna slow the pace down with description. And I'm not, so that's sort of my craft move, is like, where do I want to slow and stretch the pace? Because that to me is telling the reader, grapple with this, like look really hard at this, versus speeding it up, time hopping, or putting something into a line of dialogue. Because the way that you build mood is not, it's also through how quickly or how slowly you're reading through what you're looking at, right? So pacing is another way to sort of use craft moves to accomplish that.
Oh, that's fantastic advice. Okay, so describing actions to underscore what's not being said, pacing, and pacing's hard. You don't want to frustrate the reader, dragging it out too much, but you need to have some tension. Anybody else have a craft move that they want to share? That something you think you realize you do, maybe consciously, or you're just now thinking, yeah, I do that.
The only other thing that I would add about that, by the way, is this doesn't come in a first draft almost ever. And it doesn't necessarily, you know what I mean? Like, this is where early readers and beta readers and your editors are vital, because they're going to come back and tell you like, hey, you stretched that pace way too much. I'm bored as hell in this section, right? So like, if it's not working for you when you're trying it, get some feedback.
Yeah.
That's great advice.
And there's this one thing that it really has nothing to do with family dynamic, but it's sort of a trick I sort of discovered on my, I mean, it's sort of getting, when people enter the room, when they enter the stage, rather than giving a lot of description. So like if Annalise happened to be at the middle of the scene and her an arch nemesis, Virginia Fenton, entered the room, in her mind, in her internal dialogue in italics, you know, she would just say Virginia Fenton. And you knew she was right.
Well, we are close to the end of our panel. I'd like to give you guys an opportunity. Benji Carr had asked one question, and so I'm going to give you a choice. He said, who are your favorite fictional families that you've read? So you could maybe say something about that. And also, what are you working on now that you'd like to promote? So I'm going to start with Anne.
Well, I do love To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah.
I read it when I was a kid, and I still reread it now. So that would be my favorite fictional family, you know, because it's got everything in it that you want. And as far as the South goes, what I'm working on now, what will be turned in by the end of November, is a nonfiction book about Lucille Seeley Frank, which was Leo Frank's wife. Which will also, if you don't know who Leo Frank was, he was lynched in Marietta for the murder of Mary Fagan. So you can Google it and find because people still have a lot to say about it. I'm really surprised, but I have a connection through family back to that story, and it's just always been kind of an obsession with me. So this book is like an opus. I've been working on it since 2013, and it's got to go away and be delivered to the publisher by the end of November.
Daily favorite family book, fictional family, or what are you working on right now? Got a choice.
I can never pick favorites because I get asked these questions and then it's like, I've never read in my life. Nope, I don't know any books. So I won't pick a favorite. What am I working on? My next book out is coming out on May 2nd. It's actually a Marvel novel. This is very fun. I got to write Captain Marvel's Shadow Code, created for Carol Danvers, and that was really fun. And it was a really big stretch because it was my first time writing in a non-strictly contemporary world, and working with Marvel is amazing because they're extraordinary storytellers. And, you know, getting to sit on a phone call and have Marvel people pick apart my ideas and make them better was fabulous. So
we're looking forward to that. That's really cool. That's cool. Robert, favorite fictional family, or what are you working on?
So, as a much younger person, I loved the novel Jane Eyre, and I really liked her her state of not having a family and her search for trying to find a place in the world. So I was certainly drawn to that. And I'm working right now, I'm at the very beginning of a new novel, Southern fiction, takes place in 1931 on an isolated Georgia coastal barrier island I'm calling Good Hope. And it's going to be told in first person from the perspective of a 14-year-old girl named Leontine Skye. And her destiny is to tend an ancient tree named Damascus that is known to capture haints.
Oh, wow. That's fabulous. It starts very realistic and then wow.
It goes places.
Shaun, favorite fictional family, or what are you working on now that you like to promote?
Yeah, I really love The Barry Family from the Hotel New Hampshire by John Irving. I think that novel had a lot to do with why I wanted to write a family novel. I also really loved the families in Anna Karenina. It's such a wonderful portrait of family life that still feels shockingly modern, even all these years later. I am in edits on my second book. It's called The Dissonance. It'll be out from Pantheon. I'm hoping next year. We'll see. Edits are taking a while because of some logistical stuff. hopefully it's not my fault. I don't, but I'm hoping for next year, and it'll be a big fantasy novel, kind of in the vein of Neil Gaiman. So hopefully people will enjoy that when it comes out. Keep an eye out for it.
Well, I'll throw here at the end, favorite family dynamic is a recent one, Donna Tartt's little friend. And I was thinking about it a lot when Robert, you were talking about those what's not said and a young person's curiosity. So it's not one of the more read Donna Tartt books, but it's her definitive Southern book. It's very good.
It is really good.
Well, thank you so much. I just love how we started with family dynamic and we got to pull in craft and all these other discussion points. We ran just a tiny bit long. I apologize that we didn't get to every single question in the Q&A, but there was really good questions there. So please attend sessions, please ask questions, but the ones that I did yank out, thank you so much, because I think they really did add to our discussion. So we're going to have a quick break and then check the program, for our next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.